Hello everyone. So I think we'll be starting in about 5 minutes, assuming that they aren't horrendously late as they sometimes are. So for anybody who's here now, a quick word about format. So obviously this is an annotated debate, so I will not be speaking because it is live. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see the notes. I will be attempting as fast as I can to record and clarify and maybe even sometimes respond to the arguments as they are put forward by the participants in the debate. Afterwards, depending on how long it is, if this goes for like 3 hours, I might just call it a night. But afterwards, I like to comment on it personally and chat with you guys for a few minutes before I shut everything down. So I'm going to go quiet for a little bit while we wait, but that's how it's going to go. If you have questions or comments that you want me to address at the end, I ask that you put them in asterisks, one at the beginning and one at the end, so that I can scroll through the chat and pick them out easily. All right? Okay, cool. See you guys in about 5 minutes. All right, and now we wait. Again, just to reiterate for anyone who just came over, this is an annotated stream, which means I will be mostly silent until the end. On the right-hand side, I will be attempting as quickly as I can to write down the arguments, or type, rather, the arguments of the participants in the debate. I may comment on them occasionally. I may attempt to explicate them or even argue against them on my own. But at the end, I will take questions. The document itself will be uploaded to my server. So join the Discord if you want to get access to that. We have other YouTubers besides myself. Victor Magarino has recently adopted our server as his own, and he can be found there if you have any interest or questions concerning his content. And yeah, at the end of this, I ask that people with questions or comments that they would like me to read out or respond to, put them in asterisks, one at the beginning, one at the end. It just helps me pick them out quickly when I'm searching through the chat at the very end, because this could go on for a while, and there will be a lot of chat in all likelihood. So, that is how that is going to go. Oh, it looks like they're starting. Brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. All right, I'm going under. I'll see you guys shortly. Can I get a huzzah?
Fixing my mic.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Modern Day Debate, as we are thrilled to have you here for this epic debate and panel. And want to let you know, folks, if it's your first time here at Modern Day Debate, we are a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics. And also want to let you know, we hope that you feel welcome no matter what walk of life you are from. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over with our co-host for the night, Dylan Burns. We are thrilled to have you here, who also hosts debates on his channel all the time. So highly want to encourage you folks to check out the links, not only of Dylan, who does host debates at his channel all the time, but also of all of our speakers, as we're very thankful to have them here. And with that, Dylan, thanks for being with us and co-hosting. The floor is all yours.
Dylan Burns. I'm the host of the Hippy Dippy Roundtable, the Hippy Dippy Championship, and many other hopefully lovely programs that you all hopefully know about at this point. You can find me at twitch.tv/DylanBurnsTV. Today, we're going to be talking about critical race theory and transphobia. We're going to take it straight over to the guests, but once again, I'm happy to be collabing with James because together we're a tag team that cannot be beat. We're going to start with Destiny, who's going to tell us about his channel and his thoughts on the topic.
Hi, my name is Destiny. You can find me at twitch.tv/Destiny, youtube.com/Destiny, or Instagram or TikTok.com/Destiny. I'm broadly considered like a social democrat, and I'm pretty far left-leaning socially. I'm fairly left-leaning economically, depending on who you talk to. In terms of critical race theory, I think that a lot of the fundamental assumptions that critical race theory asserts are probably pretty agreeable to most people. I think that some of the ways that it's played out publicly is maybe been a little bit problematic. So some of the, we read through some of the curriculum for some math stuff today that was pretty cringy. But in standard fashion, conservatives hyper exaggerate some of these negative parts or make some stuff up, like that guy in Tucker Carlson does. So yeah, I'll probably be advocating, broadly speaking, for the concept of critical race theory, while acknowledging that it has some problematic implementations that we can improve on.
Okay, next we're going to be moving over to Actual Justice Warrior, also known as Sean, and his co-host, The Skeleton.
Yeah, so I'm Sean. You can find me on YouTube at the YouTube channel Actual Justice Warrior. I'm libertarian-leaning, conservative, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't really matter. As for my position on critical race theory and whether or not it should be taught in our public schools, the answer is absolutely not. I don't want conspiracy theories taught in our school. I don't want an insane racist dogma being taught in our schools. So I will be coming out 100% against it. And not just for its impact on white students. There's actually elements of critical race theory that are incredibly harmful for Black people, the very same people that supposedly this framework is designed to help and appeal to.
Wonderful. Thank you for throwing it back to me when I just put some chips in my mouth. Now we're going to throw it over to Riley, one of my close personal friends.
Oh my God, thank you. Hey everyone, my name is Riley Grace Rochong. I talk about largely law and public policy. I'm a dual JD Masters in Public Policy student here in Maryland. I'm involved in Maryland politics, and I talk about, I just try to read up on academic literature and see what good policy is what. So on critical race theory, and I'm going to be trying to do the best I can because some people, I worry that in a lot of these conversations, people will accuse each other of straw manning. But here, from listening to a lot of different perspectives on critical race theory, it seems that there's not one coherent definition of what it is. And a lot of people take it to mean very different things. So just based on what I've heard, here's kind of the major tenets, right? It's systemic racism exists in the US today through our legal system, which is something I agree with. A reason that systemic racism exists is because even if we don't have laws which explicitly discriminate against people of color, we still have laws which disparately impact people of color, and we have not adequately dealt with the effects of those laws which did explicitly discriminate against people of color, which I also agree with. Some things I don't agree with are that the reasons that systemic racism exists, which is pushed by some people, you hear that racism is inherent in society since it benefits white people. That's an argument that people make that I disagree with. People argue that white people do not fight against racism since they're not incentivized to, which there can be some arguments to make there, but I probably wouldn't agree in some of the ways I've heard it made. And that systemic racism is done in order to prevent the rise of communism. And this is where you hear a lot of people arguing that critical race theory is inherently linked to Marxism, right? To some extent, like a materialist analysis can be beneficial, but there are some people who actually will go out and like make a lot of like very far left arguments, which I think I'm broadly opposed to. So those are like what critical race theory is. Is it being taught to children? So like teaching it in schools? No, it's not being taught in schools. It's being taught primarily at the graduate level. Should it be taught at the graduate level? Probably. I mean, like in the same way that we teach lots of different things at graduate level to people who are able to access them. And all that's to be said that like, people usually are bringing this up now as kind of like a way to focus on like lower schools to try and prevent the teaching of any kind of racism. And we probably shouldn't allow that to happen since this isn't really a problem at like the K through 12 education level. So, we want to make sure that we're still teaching about racism in schools. And it would probably be reasonable to keep this to like more graduate levels. Those are probably my thoughts.
Wonderful. Now that we're done with introductions, I guess we're just going to throw it over to general discussion. I'm going to ask you all that, of course, while it's not a rule to be nice, make sugar your favorite spice. You may all begin.
Okay, so I just want to make a couple of things clear. Critical race theory is not teaching about the civil rights history of the United States of America. It's not teaching about negative history or history that doesn't look positively on the United States of America. It's a specific ideology that was developed in universities in response to disciplines like civil rights disciplines and like critical legal studies. And to my knowledge, the reason that we're talking about this is because of the potential for implementation in K through 12 education, not necessarily in the university level. Is that not the case? Did I like misread the parameters of the debate?
I think that's pretty true. Can I just curious, what is your impression of why it was developed in response to things like critical legal studies?
Well, they tell us that they don't like the fact that there were too many white people in these disciplines. That's specifically for the civil rights discipline. It was almost like a counter like movement against that. And it was the idea that like white scholars could not represent the actual experiences of these Black people. So I believe it was in the 70s. And correct me if I'm wrong on the year, because whatever, I read it a little while ago. They were trying to discourage white people from writing about race in academia and forming this new discipline for them to better like articulate what they're feeling in society. It's very much reliant on feelings, which is one of the problems with it. And it also avoids outside scrutiny from other parts of academia because it actually, this is like intentional, it claims that it's being critical of those like outside institutions that do normal academic scrutiny. So it doesn't even subject itself to the normal rules of academia. So I don't understand why we would allow these people to implement their curriculum in our public schools.
So, quick, just on the line of questioning. So critical race theory developed, so we listened earlier to Derek Bell talk about this. The reason why critical race theory developed in response to critical legal studies is because the idea of analyzing certain things, so in this case, the criminal justice system, just through the lens of laws, seems like it wasn't perfectly explanatory for some of the things that people wanted to look at. So, for instance, when we look at something like Brown v. Board of Education, if the 14th Amendment has existed for so long, why would it take so long for the Supreme Court to overrule like segregation at schools? If you look at it through a critical legal studies lens, it's very hard to make arguments based on precedent. It's very hard to make arguments based on new legal analysis. It seems like you're missing something in terms of how you analyze these particular rulings. So we need like another lens or another tool that we can view these kinds of legal changes through. And then this was largely in the mid 70s, I think, where critical race theory came in, where it was more like, well, what's another critical theory that we can use to kind of critique or add to our understandings of, like the legal process in the United States. So insofar as that's concerned, I mean, that's pretty convincing to me that the idea of analyzing the legal system only through laws is a little bit silly. It's pretty obvious that our legislature, even all the way up to the Supreme Court, is going to be influenced by the society around us and an intersection of other things, and not just like, letter of the law. So insofar as that goes, I don't think that it's like a wholly absurd method or a wholly absurd way of analyzing, structures in society, especially the legal system, because there are things that like a critical legal studies take would miss. It seems to be the case.
And also, Sean, can I like respond on the point about like the there are some people in this movement who don't want white people talking about it? Because I mean, I read some of the literature earlier today, And we can come back to this more if you want to. It doesn't seem to be the case that it's just the rule is white people cannot talk about this, but it's rather recognizing that because white people do not have the shared lived experience of people of color, that they're less likely, not necessarily the case, but they're going to be less likely to understand those kinds of experiences than people who don't come from that experience. I kind of get that because, like, as a trans person, and there's always trans discourse happening, as will be the case later in the panel. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that like cis people can't talk about these issues, right? Like, obviously, there are a lot of cis people who contribute a lot to the discourse, but also, there can be cis people who don't recognize some things because they don't have that same lived experience, and simultaneously, there can also be trans people who also don't have the greatest arguments just because they're trans, right? It's just a likelihood thing. That's not to say that there probably aren't people out there who will take that to the extra mile and say like, oh, no white people can talk about that. Those people are silly, don't listen to them, and I will criticize them as much as is needed to. But like, it's more about just recognizing likelihoods.
Let's give Sean several minutes to respond to both points.
Okay, so on the point about how lived experiences aren't shared across all demographics, yeah, I can understand that premise. But the problem is we're talking about an academic discipline. And when we're talking about an academic discipline, there needs to be some way to verify, check, there needs to be some scrutiny. What you find in a bunch of critical race theory is storytelling, is people talking about their personal experiences, and they use as a shield of criticism the fact that they're often personally hurt. So most of these critical race theory scholars are scholars of color, and they'll be telling a story that happened to them in their real life, which is, I guess, fine. And a lot of them are sad. Some of them are ridiculous, but a lot of them are sad. And I feel sorry for that person in that story. But we're talking about a discipline that is supposed to be implemented in our public schools. And you can extrapolate off of a story only so much. And I have examples of these stories and the wild extrapolations from them that I would love to go over with you if you think that this is something that we need to be teaching in our public schools.
I mean, like, that's not to say, I mean, like, quantitative or qualitative data can be useful to an extent. It's just important to be able to recognize the difference between qualitative and quantitative data, right? Like, like stories and like individual anecdotes, like they can be useful, but it's primarily important to make sure that we're using them to be able to demonstrate larger phenomena that's otherwise qualitatively provable. But that's not to say that they don't have any use, right? Now, if these are being used in place of quantitative data, then there's a valid criticism to be had there. But as far as I'm aware, like a lot of these issues usually have some kind of quantitative data to be able to back them, right? So, being able to have the stories in that instance can be beneficial to see how these things actually play out in people's lives.
So I think what's happening here is we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what critical race theory is, because I've spent a good amount of time reading over this in preparation for this. And the idea that we could check these stories or this myth making against more objective numbers, and like that is somehow a counterbalance, is something that is completely divorced from critical race theory. They reject objective metrics as white supremacy or indicative of the overall white culture. They say objective truth is just the dominant culture's truth. This is why I don't want this taught.
Sorry, do you have just like an example of that?
Oh, so okay. So a perfect example of this comes from Regina Austin and her promotion of conspiracy theories. So Regina Austin is at the Pennsylvania School of Law, and she's claimed that O.J. Simpson, Clarence Thomas, Malcolm X, Marion Barry, the Coors Brewing Company, and Church's Fried Chicken have all been the subject of anti-Black conspiracy theories. But what got her in a little bit of trouble is when she was called out for promoting the conspiracy theory that AIDS was created by the United States government. And her response to this, and you can find this in her readings, was that, well, it might not be literally true that AIDS was created by the United States government, but it's spiritually correct, which is something that Ocasio-Cortez obviously borrowed for her famous quote. And the reason it's spiritually correct is because it reminds us of the Tuskegee experiments. And like in the Tuskegee experiments, it's not really a point about whether or not the source of AIDS is the US government, just like the source of syphilis wasn't the US government. What really matters is that the US government has the cure. So it's very conspiratorial. And when confronted on their conspiracy theorizing, this is how they respond, or this is at least how Regina Austin responded. So yeah, like they reject objective metrics and
But how
they
is that?
promote and excuse negative behaviors.
Well, how is that like represented? Because I mean, like that doesn't
Well, I
seem
mean,
to
it's
really
a scholar
connect with
in
the
critical race
idea.
theory.
Well, how does that connect to critical race theory? Because I like, yeah, like if we're going to like to spread what amounts to a lie, or at least to spread an accusation that's unsubstantiated that the government spread AIDS or that the government created AIDS for some kind of purpose. Like, yeah, that's condemnable. But like, how does that connect back to critical race theory? Like, I'm missing that link right now.
It's from Regina Austin, critical race theory scholarist at Pennsylvania School of Law. She's one of
But
the
how does
leading
that-
scholars.
But how does that make it we can take critical race theory and like look at what it is.
So part
and
of
I just want to know like how this is
part
applying.
of critical race theory is excusing negative behaviors from the Black community. Whatever behavior you could possibly find is excused by critical race theory. So when questioned about conspiracy theorizing, she said that this is okay because this is a way to fight back against the counterculture. And then even if it's not literally true, it's okay. It's spiritually true because it reflects the experience of Black Americans in this country. And her example was the Tuskegee experiments. This is a common theme throughout critical race theory literature, is that whenever they're proven factually wrong on anything, they fall back to, well, what you don't understand is that these are the things that are related to we're living in a white supremacist society. And again, this is not an objective discipline. So like, this is not stuff I want taught in our schools.
I guess that what I'm missing is that like I don't understand what makes it critical. Like, can you define to me like what you think from looking at the literature, what you think critical race theory is?
Well, you read the scholars of critical race theory and they define it.
Well, yeah, but what's your impression of the literature? Like after having read it, like what's your takeaway?
Your core tenets are rejection of color blindness, like I just said. There's excuse making for minorities for any type of behavior, no matter what it is. There's the rejection of integration, as it's considered cultural genocide, which is repeated by many critical race theory scholars, including Patricia Williams, and I believe this guy's name is Gary Peller. Like these are the core tenets of it, that there's a white dominant culture and any move toward that dominant culture is cultural genocide. And that we should,
it doesn't really, like some of those I don't think are actually representative. Like the idea that critical race theory, like by definition, rejects any criticism of like when minorities do like take certain kinds of actions. Like I just haven't seen that in like any of the, like you can bring up examples where people who are associated with it have tried to excuse it, but that doesn't seem to be like we could criticize those people and their excuses, but that doesn't seem to fit in with like what it is.
I'll give you a perfect example. So Patricia Williams is an advocate against proper English being taught in our public schools, right? She believes that Black people they used to call it Ebonics. I forgot what the word is for it now.
African American Vernacular English.
Yeah, Ebonics. So like they're that's their own distinct dialect, and that it serves them well in their communities, and forcing them to learn English is improper. Like it's a form of cultural genocide. Now, this is incredibly harmful to the Black community. And the reason why it's incredibly harmful is, when's the last time you saw a math textbook written in Ebonics or a chemistry textbook written in Ebonics? The reason we have a common language and the reason people are trying through the public education system to get people to read and write appropriately is because you're basically putting them behind the 8 ball by not doing so. But it is viewed, again, as a form of cultural genocide to go in the direction of speaking proper English, or as it is called in critical race theory, cracker English.
So wait, real quick, before we go too far into this, I hate the way this is set up because it feels like a 2-in-1. So this is really weird. But before we go too into this, it might not even be worth discussing critical race theory. It might actually just be worth discussing the foundations of critical race theory, because it might be the case that we either completely agree or disagree with each other based on our agreement or disagreement with those foundations. So, for instance, when we talk about teaching African American vernacular English versus like contemporary English or whatever, it's probably a good thing that we all like have a common language that we speak, but to claim that AEVE or Ebonics, as we want to call it, to claim that that's like a separate language is not necessarily true. It's not like it's random. It's just another dialect that's emerged in English speech, or more precisely in American speech. I mean, we can talk about like, I think any of these particular like foundational things, like should AAV be taught or not taught, or should we encourage or discourage it? Or, you know, like, should we teach that upholding certain norms is a form of cultural genocide? Like we probably have to hammer out our conversations on those topics. Otherwise, we're just going to be speaking past each other, to where one person is going to support critical race theory because they believe in these underlying foundations, versus another person obviously disagrees, not because they disagree with critical race theory, but because they disagree with the underlying foundations of it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, I'm fine. I mean, like, I don't personally, for the reasons I laid out earlier, really like adopt it as like I don't find it to be the most useful framework personally. Like the idea is like there are some people who interpret it to be like, oh yeah, the reason why systemic racism exists is or in order to perpetuate a system of hierarchy that specifically benefits white people, which I don't think is satisfied. And there does seem to be like a lot of speculation there. But I mean, like, as far as a lot of the other tenets, you know, like acknowledging that we should probably be able to like teach some form of systemic racism in school, like, yeah, like we can discuss a lot of the premises.
We can start with, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm not against teaching the history of racism in schools. And again, like, I have to ask, what is it exactly this debate about? Because if we're just talking randomly about critical race theory, that gets us nowhere. Like, I was led to believe that this would be about whether or not this should be imported into the classroom, like what's going on nationwide. You have a bunch of votes up and down on whether or not this is going to be incorporated in the curriculum. California passed the law a couple of years ago. They have yet to implement the curriculum that requires this as a graduation requirement. I thought that's what we were discussing. And to me, to discuss that, it would be logical to discuss what's in critical race theory textbooks, what the major figures have written about the subject, and the ridiculous extrapolations that they make based on their anecdotal experience that isn't very valuable.
Well, so yeah, so I agree, but that's what I'm saying is we should probably focus on, because if you believe in all of the core tenets of critical race theory, you're going to probably think it should be implemented. But if you don't, then you're probably going to think it should be implemented. So it seems like it would just make more sense to talk about like what fundamental aspects of critical race theory do we accept or reject, and then kind of move from there would be my guess. So that would be my suggestion. So you listed out earlier some things that I've heard that most people won't, that most people like, there's some commonly shared elements of critical race theory, like upholding like a certain type of society can be considered a form of white supremacy, or the teaching of AAVE as a dialect versus incorrect speak or something. I mean, we could focus in even on the African-American vernacular English, or because if we argue like, yeah, CRT should be taught, oh no, it shouldn't be taught, we're not really arguing over CRT, we're arguing about the underlying ideas. This is what it feels like to me. Or we should be. Sorry, go ahead. Somebody say something. Jesus Christ.
You're fine. I mean, like, also just a comment on the on the voting nationwide. My understanding is that like a lot of the voting has been specifically at the state level on states outlawing the teaching in public schools. My understanding of a lot of that legislative discussion has been specifically looking at like a lot of more conservative figures trying to push to outlaw it in schools. And it seems to be, and I mean, like, this isn't necessarily the case, but a lot of people are talking about it as if it's already being taught in schools, or as if a lot of people are like pushing for it. And I'm just not sure if the evidence is quite there that a lot of people really want it. And rather that this is being used as like a stand-in issue to prevent the teaching of like broader issues related to race and racism.
I mean, critical race theory is already being taught in schools. I did a segment on the Edina school district in Minnesota that was teaching this. They called it an equity curriculum, and it required everybody that's on the staff, including the bus drivers, to be trained in dismantling white supremacy. So there are isolated pockets that form the basis for people trying to restrict this. There's also been a greater push to add this into school curriculums post the death of George Floyd. So yeah, we see major news stories about states and local municipalities having hearings about it at their school boards and voting it up or down. But yeah, it has been implemented, probably mostly in the electives. Like California has it in its electives right now. They haven't implemented it as a graduation requirement. But yeah, this is what we're discussing, no?
Well, yeah, so to be clear real quick on that, right? So when we say critical race theory is being implemented, even in elementary school curriculum, that's not really the case. staff training is going to be a bit different than like the curriculum that's taught to kids, because it feels like a little bit of a bait and switch where like conservatives will talk about the evils of critical race theory, and then you think, oh my God, they're teaching it in schools, teaching it to the kids. But in reality, what this actually comes out is like in the form of like sensitivity seminars or critical race theory like seminars, or like a way of teaching in the classroom that's not like teaching children critical race theory, but it's just like a different way to guide like how you teach or function in the classroom. It's a little bit differently. It's a little different, I think, than just saying like they're teaching critical race theory to our kids in schools, I think.
I mean, so let me be clearer.
Mhm.
They're teaching critical race theory to our kids in schools. Like I do a video series on K-12 indoctrination in conjunction with an organization, and I have like 30 videos in the series. So like there are specific examples of this being implemented to children as young as kindergartners, where they're teaching them about their white privilege and the systemic oppression and how the system is rigged against their Black students. So yeah, like they are teaching it. I'm just saying I understand it's not necessarily even on a state level that it's being
Gotcha.
taught in most cases. So
Okay,
like, there
okay.
are individual examples. This is what the reaction or the response is too. And there's
Sure.
a greater push post Floyd.
Can I just ask like how, so you gave like one example. Do you have like any sources like on that example, and like just like any source on like how widespread this is? Just like so I can understand like the scale of like the issue of it being taught to children.
Well, like I said, California has passed a law that says they have to come up with something. There's been sample curriculums that have been shot down. They have it in their elective courses. Edina Middle School, the Edina School District was one example. Like I don't have them offhand. I didn't like review all my older videos on the topic, but like I do have an entire video series based on this. But there's
then-
like, examples every like they come up in the news every now and again. And what the organization that I do those videos with does is they like combine them into an overall thing. So I mean, I could look up what they got, but like
Okay, I mean, like it just doesn't seem like a lot of the conversation seems to match with like the scale of the issue, I guess, is like my concern, right? Because I mean, like you know, like we could probably make some kind like with the amount of national attention on this, and we could say that there's like a reasonable issue to be had here, but it seems like a lot of people are using this or talking about it so much in the national eye compared to how much is actually happening, to the point where it seems like it's a stand-in for some kind of other issue that people are trying to discuss rather than the actual issue itself. Does that make sense? Like, I just want to communicate that, like, it seems like the reaction from a lot of people has been disproportionate to the size of the issue as it currently stands, to the point where it makes me wonder if there's some kind of other motivation for people engaging in the subject matter. Does that make sense?
Well, sure, but like there are examples, and like again, this is like saying like it's not that big of an issue. Like I didn't pick the topics for this. Like,
well, I'm not saying it's an issue. Like, I'm not saying it's not an issue either, right? Like, if children are being taught, like, hey, the fact that you're white makes you inherently racist, and related things like that. Like, yeah, I'll broadly agree. Like, that is bad, and children should not be taught that, right? Like, yeah, I agree. It just seems like the reaction that people have had, if it's only in like one or a handful of schools, is for the amount of attention it's getting nationally. It seems like other people are trying to use this as a stand-in issue for other, you know, just like talking about racism generally.
Yeah. Well, Destiny referenced earlier that he was looking over some math courses on a stream. I didn't watch that stream, but would that be the math courses that were proposed in Oregon and California?
Probably the one talking about like how Black people need to run around the room to learn math. This is really stupid.
Like, so I mean,
paraphrasing a bit, but yeah.
There is a push to implement this. Like, it's like saying, oh, well, it's not that many places. I mean, like if I was a parent, which I'm not, this would be something that I would be concerned about. And again, like even beyond that, there's like a bunch of pushes for equity that try to teach things like I was talking about before, that like Ebonics is just as valid a form of English. And as I previously stated, this sets back the Black community. It makes it harder for them to read in schools. There's a reason that in India and in China, all these places where English is becoming a second language or has already become a second language, they're learning proper, appropriate English because it's the language of international business. So a curriculum that rejects this is harmful to Black students.
Yeah, I guess that like what I'm asking here, let me ask this question. Do you think it's at least reasonable to come to the conclusion that like one of the motivations for why this is so widespread in America at the moment, why like a ton of major news outlets are talking about this at this moment. Do you think it's at least reasonable to surmise that like one of the reasons why, since it's a relatively small scale issue, is because other people are using it as a stand-in for like, trying to prevent the talk about racism at all in K through 12? Like, do you think that's at least like, even if you don't necessarily think that's the case yourself, do you think it's at least reasonable that that could be why some people are motivated in this discussion?
No, I don't think it's about trying to prevent discussions of racism. Again, it's like if you talk to these people, they seem fine with teaching like the ideals of like the civil rights movement or certain like negative history of the United States of America. It's about the way that critical race theory frames it. Again, this is a movement that was anti-civil rights scholarship. It's anti the concept of colorblindness. So I think
why is it only getting attention now?
For the outsized interest, the reason it's getting attention now is post George Floyd, there's been a push to implement this more and more. Any issue that involves angry parents gets disproportionate attention in the United States of America because children, like somebody think of the children. There's an entire Simpsons character based around this concept that's as old as time. So like that's not unusual. We're talking about the implementation in public schools. Also, this involves our tax dollars. So it's like, do I want my tax dollars financing something that by its very definition is pushing a political ideology? In fact, critical race theory scholars are often saying that you're trying to put forward a political goal or political goals in their work, and they need to bias it towards those political goals in order to counteract the bias in what is called objective reality.
We'll give you a chance to respond, Riley.
To be fair to like critical race theory, usually what critical theory entails is that they try to see, like they do own that they marry like prescriptive and descriptive thought, in that like they try to engage with a lens that aims to improve society as opposed to just describing society as it is, right? Like that does seem to be the case. I'm not sure if that's necessary. Like you could say that's a critique for why you shouldn't use it, but I'm not sure if that's something to be said against like the tool itself, if that makes sense, right? Like that's not necessarily a reason why it shouldn't be taught to just like improve society.
I mean, the reasons that it shouldn't be taught, it's not like, yeah, anybody could say they're trying to improve society. The reasons that I said it shouldn't be taught is they don't subject themselves to scrutiny from other parts of academia. They reject that scrutiny as what you call, as part of being absorbed into like the white dominance of objective academia. Like they're pretty obvious about this. The emphasis on storytelling and anecdotes that don't really connect to overall things and crazy extrapolations. It's the examples that like I'm ready to give, like if you want to hear some of them, are just absurd.
Then let me ask the question then, because I know you brought up some examples earlier. So I know that you brought up the example with the person who gave the unsubstantiated claim about the AIDS crisis, and I can agree that that's something bad. But now I'm starting to wonder, like, if we get into examples, and we can go through them if you want to, like. I guess I'm worried about describing things which may not be necessarily representative of the movement, but which are extremely bad examples of this idea or of this framework, right?
It's an academic discipline. Like I'm going over the like foundational people in this academic discipline. I specifically didn't go after the easy targets like Ibram X. Kendi, because people can argue that Ibram X. Kendi is relatively new on the scene and has gained popular and all that. So I went back even further to look at like foundational books. Like for instance, Patricia Williams, who wrote the book, and I think it came out in 1989, called The Rooster's Egg, which is just a series of her telling stories and making wild extrapolations based on those stories, has a section in there about how she went into one store and she saw a comparable black doll that was discounted compared to a white doll. And she extrapolated from that capitalism from one store. Like this is not a serious discipline. And this book, look it up, look up the reviews. You'll see all the big names saying it's a seminal work in critical race theory. Patricia Williams, like this is what we're talking about. This is the foundation of at one store is evidence of capitalism being racist.
I want to give you a chance to respond if you'd like, Riley. Also, then, it is true, a 3-person panel. We lost a person 2 hours before we started, and so it is a different, you could say, vibe with 3 people. So we do want to ask Destiny any thoughts on what's been discussed so far, and then Riley, if you do want a chance to respond after that, we'll give you a chance before we go to a particular question that somebody had offered in the chat.
Well, I think I'll let them go down a line of questioning and then I'll jump in. I don't want to like she gives a huge response to him and then I give him a whole bunch of shit to do with, and then he has to respond to her and me, and then it's like a huge clusterfuck. So I'm just kind of letting them go.
Appreciate it. I like it. Go ahead, Riley.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to understand like, and I can understand that that's like. So I think that there's a valid critique that like that you can have someone who you're alleging essentially that this person is representative of the movements and she's one of the founding authors. And right now, I guess I'm wondering, because I've been reading a lot of the literature, I assume the same as you, in preparation for this, accurate representation of where a lot of people are at with the ideas as they currently stand, right? Like it seems to be more focused on the idea that that there are certain forms of systemic discrimination that can exist in society, regardless of whether or not they're explicit or implicit, that can end up creating like social hierarchies between different racial categories. There's variations. There's not like a concrete definition, but it seems really weird to take like one person who may not be representative of the movement as it currently stands and say this is the entirety of it, right? Like that doesn't seem to be charitable to what critical race theory says for itself nowadays.
I mean, but you're giving me like vagaries when I'm giving you specifics. And again, I'm not taking like, here's a person that said something about critical race theory. Like I'm highlighting foundational works, like a Rooster's Egg or The Rooster's Egg is a foundational work in the arena of critical race theory. Like you can look it up. I'm not like nonsensing you. I'm sure you'll find it on Wikipedia.
I mean, like I've listened to several people talk about it as well. I mean, like, sure, we can go into examples,
like,
but I
these,
mean, like,
these are examples that are in there. And again, it's an overall, and like, this isn't something like that's like conspiratorial or something that's outside the norm. Like these have always been the criticisms of this discipline, that it relies on storytelling and lived experience, and it avoids scrutiny because oftentimes the authors or the people telling the stories happen to be Black or non-white themselves, and they're reaching from their own experience and they're telling us about the pain that they endured. And it's not like you can build a discipline off of how some person subjectively feels when they're telling a story. Like that's not the good foundations of academia. And like this again is not something that is denied. They're saying they're trying to deconstruct our traditional views of knowledge in academia. They say that knowledge and objectivity comes from the dominant culture. I don't agree with that. That's why I don't want it taught in the schools.
Well, do you think that you can reasonably parse out people who have engaged in this discipline, who have engaged in a way which is negligently, and be able to otherwise still preserve some of the ideas which are actually useful? Because I mean, I understand like you're citing examples where if that is happening and to the extent it's happening, then yeah, that's meritable of criticism. But it seems like this seems like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, where it's, I think that we can reasonably be able to criticize bad practices in academia while still otherwise preserving some good ideas. Because like what Destiny said at the beginning, like when we're engaging in discussion of the law, especially as someone who is studying the law, it is good to be able to look at the law through a lens other than just assuming that everyone is a perfectly rational actor, always being able to come to conclusions in the law just based on precedent, because that doesn't make sense either. And, there's worthy criticism to be had of that kind of perspective. So wouldn't you agree that we could be able to preserve some of the useful aspects of this kind of thinking and be able to simultaneously criticize some people who have engaged with it in a negligent manner?
So I would agree with that. If we're talking about like philosophy, like utilitarianism, and then I found like a dumb utilitarian argument, I totally understand that. But that's because the foundations of utilitarianism are somewhat consistent or mostly consistent. But we're talking about critical race theory, which specifically rejects objective knowledge. So
but that doesn't seem to be representative of where it's at now. Like if I've looked at like several different sources, and like you said, like I can send them to you as well, but I don't see anywhere in any of them that they'd say that like a central tenet is rejecting objective knowledge.
It's very much based on subjective knowledge and lived experience. And it, again, critical race theory does not subject themselves to scrutiny from other parts of academia. And they literally say the idea of objectivity, of correctness. I mean, there was the math example where like I've seen the screenshots of the textbooks where they talk about how it's not necessarily about getting the right answer. It's the journey to get there. And that's not what math is about. Like Like
Well,
this is
my
a
understanding.
fundamental disagreement. Like I mean, if you read David Bell, if you read,
Okay, I said I wasn't going to
what's the other guy's
chat,
name?
but this
Delgado,
is
I believe. Like
ridiculous.
this is what they say. They don't hide
Like,
this from you. So I don't know where you're
let me
getting
turn this
this
volume down. I don't think Destiny and Riley prepared for this at all. They've been circling the drain on the same topic the entire debate so far. They can't. And here's the thing, like, Riley is correct. Like, his examples aren't representative. For a start, they're underdeveloped. He hasn't actually cited an example and given anything approximating to, like, a citation. But she should be able, Destiny as well, should be able to directly challenge these examples and scrutinize them. They just have no acquaintance whatsoever with the material. AJW seems to have some acquaintance with the material, at least enough to talk about it in reference. That these people don't. They've just done no homework. Oh my god. Alright, I think Destiny's talking. Let's...
doing any type of math problem. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if you've taken any higher level math, the understanding the processes is a billion times more important than winding up with the correct answer. Or at least in my calc assignments or on your tests, like if you had like a 10-point problem, I don't think it was uncommon for like the answer would be worth like 2 points or 3 points maybe, but like showing your work and all the different steps are going to be like where the majority of the points are given on a round. Like you could pass a calc exam, like calc B or C, you could pass these exams and get like half the answers wrong if you showed your work every step of the way and just missed answers. That's not necessarily 100% baked into this, but just on that, math is about the journey, not the answer. There were a lot of cringy things in that critical race theory textbook about math, but there were also a lot of things that like are actually really true. We need to modernize the way that we teach math a lot because right now it's taught in a horrible way. That's just kind of like one thing to the side. A second thing is, I think that so I'm going to sound like a critical race theory proponent. I think that we have a very Western-centric view of some things like when we say objective fact or objective truth, I think we tend to look at things in a certain way where we believe that like, I'll take the full position. Maybe because we're white or because it's Eurocentric or whatever, to where we have like a correct view of how to view like something like, say, history, that there are objective facts there and that's how we view it. I think that it's good to take a step back and realize that when we look at like how events occur in history, that isn't actually really the case. Even for white people, for black people, whoever, we don't actually have like these objective views of history. Like we very much kind of pick and choose which facts we want to account for, which facts we want to talk about, and then some things kind of fall off to the wayside. I don't know if I'm going to light a firecracker on this debate, but like a really good example of that recently is like we have a big disagreement in this country right now over what happened in the last election, where I think around half the country believes that that election is fraudulent. So I find it a little bit hypocritical, I would guess, that we would look to like critical race theory and say it's absolutely ridiculous that you're going to reject the objective reality that all of us live and believe in when right now there is, and that's just on one issue, we can name the coronavirus or global warming or anything else, but we actually do have not only these objective truth divides in the US, but we actually have like epistemic divides in terms of how we even arrive at truth. I don't think that teaching that there is some subjectivity there is the worst thing in the world, when that does seem to be how most of us live our lives.
Right. Well, look, I take your point about show your work in math classes, but like mathematics as a discipline is about getting objectively the correct answer. Like whether or not you get some points in school doesn't change the fact that if you're an accountant and you misreport profits or earnings, the SEC is going to come for you. And you can't say, well, I showed my work and it looks like I got everything right. I just forgot to do this or that. If you're trying to land a rover on Mars, like there's detailed math calculations that go into that. And when the rover misses Mars and ends up floating into space, you're not going to be able to go to the heads of NASA and say, hey, look, I showed my work, seemed about right, my bad. Like there's actually consequences for not pursuing objectively right answers. And to the extent that show your work is graded, it's because they're saying that you're on the right path to going there. So it's a weird like little tangent to go on. As for like the examples of the election or whatever, like, yeah, there's adults that don't agree on things. Like that's fine. And history is way more subjective than people believe because we're relying on the accounts of people. But critical race theory in our schools, at least in some of the ways that it's been proposed to be implemented, if not implemented, is not just about like the subjective studies. And on top of that, it's not so much that it's objectively wrong that is my issue, which would be an issue. It's that they don't care about being objectively correct. It's a discipline that rejects objectivity.
So I don't think that it's man. We get into very strange epistemic discussions when we talk about objectivity because it's such a hard topic to get into. To visit really quick. So when we talk about like it is important to get the right answer for accounting or for landing things on Mars, I absolutely agree with you there. Those are jobs though, right? That's like where you're supposed to be, for the most part, done learning. I mean, you learn some job things, but like you're out of school now, and now you have to compute the right answer. But getting the right answer for jobs is going to be way different than like practicing like the journey to get there. For instance, if you look at literally anything, it could be music, it could be sports, right? You're never in your life going to play a basketball game where you have the opportunity to like throw like 100 free throws in a row, but that's how you practice, right? You're never going to be in a game where you just do 100 free throws, but you practice that way, right? And then much the same way in school, right? Learning fundamentals or learning different ways to learn is like it's an important part of that quote unquote journey. And I think that especially when it comes to math, I think we have been hyper focused on just like get the right answer. That's the only thing that matters. Memorize the formulas. And rote memorization is probably one of the most harmful things that exist today when it comes to the learning of math. I didn't notice this until I reached my mid 20s when I saw people getting really mad about Common Core. There are a whole bunch of like math like videos that show like train tracks and boxes, and it's like this is how you do division, and everybody got really fucking mad about it. And when I watched those videos, I was like, oh fuck, I thought everybody did math in their head like this, and it became very obvious that like a lot of people are really bad at math, and it's just because they don't think about it much in their head in certain ways, and you're never really taught to. You're just like given rote memorization. So I do agree with you that like obviously it's good to get the answer at the end of the day when you're working in your job, but in an academic environment, that's kind of like where you're more free to like explore and grow, and like how do you learn the processes by how we get to the right answers. In terms of like objectively correct, so history, we always learn about history. We never actually learn history, though. What we're learning in whenever we read a book or whenever we take a classroom is we're engaging in something called historiography, where what we've actually done is you don't learn every single event about anything. We don't learn every body. We don't learn every territory. What we learn is we learn a collection of facts that we've kind of taken in order to tell a narrative. And you can even see a divide in the country over some things that some people would consider like not ambiguous. So, for instance, when we tell the story of the Civil War, the North were the good guys and the South were the bad guys. Traditionally, that's how it's taught most of the time, at least. But there are a lot of people, well, some people in the United States that would disagree with that telling of the story, right? And then other people say that when we tell the story of like U.S. history, we typically tell it from the perspective of like, well, who were Americans, right? It was like the Puritans, those four groups that came over initially, the people that fought wars and blah blah blah. But other people are like, we have the 1619 Project from the initiative from the New York Times. Like, well, let's actually tell this story from a different perspective. Now, some people argue that like things like the 1619 Project are wrong, or that's fake, or that's not objective history or whatever. But it is. It's just history from another point of view. So I guess I would have to like see. I would be very surprised. I could be wrong, but I would dig if you look at this. I would be very surprised if a proponent of critical race theory was like, "Oh no, I don't believe in any objective facts, and I reject all mathematical axioms. I reject all epistemic axioms." It's probably more along the lines of like, we need to be really careful when we say objectively correct, because what we really mean when we say objectively correct is this is the prevailing culture of the time, and if you disagree with any of the narratives that exist, you are actually wrong and stupid. A really good example that keeps coming up is African American vernacular English. Like, we want to say it's dumb and we want to call it ebonics and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But almost nobody in the United States, even in corporate environments, will speak like actual proper written standard English. I think it's standard American English might be what it's called. Like, there are tons of forms of slang that are employed in a lot of different ways. And when we talk about African American vernacular English, I don't think we're necessarily saying like it needs to be spoken in a corporate boardroom, just more so that if you're in a corporate environment and someone comes in and they're like, howdy y'all, today we're going to talk about, maybe not howdy, but like, hey y'all, there's like a lot of slang from other parts of the country where if you speak it, people are like, okay, yeah, it's just like whatever. But if you speak Ebonics or African American vernacular English, people automatically think this guy's a fucking idiot. What a moron speaking Ebonics. This guy's not educated. When in reality, like, I mean, it exists as a separate, like, legitimate dialect, just like any other dialect is formed. But for some reason, when we look at this particular dialect, we instantly think uneducated, stupid, immature, like idiot, low vocabulary. All right, sorry, I'm speaking a lot. Go for it.
I mean, like I said, you went over a bunch of different things, and a lot of it's not related. Like, I don't disagree that history is like the highlights from whatever historian or what we can glean from looking back on the past. The 1619 Project is objectively wrong. The first Black people who arrived in 1619 didn't come as slaves, so that's objectively incorrect. Free Black people made it to the Americas before slaves, so I mean, that is what it is. But as for your point on Ebonics, and I call it Ebonics because I literally forget every time you go into the African American vernacular English, if that was it, because that's what it used to be called. it's not about it sounding stupid or making you sound uneducated. Like, I didn't grow up in a neighborhood where everybody spoke all prim and proper, but it's important that the school teaches you to read the version of English where most of scholarship is actually written in, because it greatly disadvantages you not to know this. This is what we did with white Southerners who spoke ridiculous, broken English, a lot of which is what led Black people to speak in Ebonics, because it traces back to the South. And that broken English actually traces back to Southerners' origin countries, which is the borderlands between the England and Scotland on the island of Britain. So, like, this idea that we would say, oh, it's just as valid. Yeah, sure, you can communicate information, but it greatly disadvantages you not being able or not being able to understand certain words and being able to have access to the wealth of knowledge that is written in the appropriate English language. We've seen other groups have to go through this over time, like the Germans had written language well before their Eastern European counterparts. So a lot of Eastern Europeans, in order to find scholarship, had to learn German in order to learn whatever trades they want. And it gave the Germans or Germanic people a great advantage over their Eastern European counterparts. And it led to social problems between them and all that. So I'm saying the schools should, it's like, to me, it's not even a debate. The schools should teach appropriate English. It greatly disadvantages Black students for the schools to try to cater to them out of some misguided white guilt or critical race theory that tells us that it's just as valid. I think I lost whatever. Well, as for your point about mathematical terms, in the Oregon textbook, it actually says that teaching kids about the Pythagorean theorem is damaging because it gives them the impression that math was created by white people, because I think the Pythagorean theorem is Greek. So that was like a specific example from a textbook, a proposed textbook that I saw today in the lead up to this. So like, they do want to invade the hard sciences, and the Pythagorean theorem is incredibly helpful. There's a reason we use it. There's a reason we use algebra and all these other terms that come from the Islamic Golden Age, because it objectively works and it's repeatable around the world.
Yeah, so I think that we would all agree on this, and I think we would have to find. I couldn't find examples of this. So for just very quickly on these two things. So maybe this is a disconnect. I don't think anybody advocating for critical race theory is saying that we should no longer teach proper English. I think it's just to be a bit more respectful to what we've now deemed AAVE. I think that's the idea. It's not that like we're going to teach kids Ebonics in school. We're going to literally teach them how to write English like rappers or whatever. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just more to have to treat it as a legitimate dialect rather than just like a horrible thing that shouldn't even be regarded as a dialect is the first thing. And then the second thing in regards to no one has said we shouldn't teach the Pythagorean theorem. I think it was more just when you can find, I shouldn't say this because we read this earlier. It was more when you have the opportunity to find and highlight the successes of like minority mathematicians, stuff like that would be good to do. A lot of theorems are named after people. A lot of these people are white. To have people in the classroom identify more with the stuff they're learning, sometimes it might be nice if you can point out examples of like, here is a woman that worked at NASA doing computations for, the Apollo missions. Here's a Black mathematician that, discovered this thing or this thing. I think the curriculum just wanted you to highlight, if you could, like, or encourage teachers to highlight when they could, like, these are the successes of minority mathematicians, not to just stop teaching certain math or stop teaching English. And I don't think we disagree that either of those things are necessarily a bad thing, or I would hope not.
Mean, you say things like no one is proposing this, nobody is saying this, but again, like, this comes from the scholars. Patricia Williams compared teaching a proper English to Jim Crow. Like, because you're imposing these standards on non-white people. Like, you have to read the scholarship before you assert that, like, nobody is suggesting this. Gary Peller says that not only proper English, but a bunch of other things that were instituted on the South in Black schools are forms of white oppression, like the removal of corporal punishment, the expansion beyond single house, where you get rid of the maternal relationship between the teacher and the student. Like, these people are against integration, and that's not just racial integration. It's like the standardization of education. They consider forms of Jim Crow or white supremacy. Like, this is, again, from the scholars in the field. Like,
I'm sure that there are definitely
look up any one of these scholars and their writings.
Well, I mean, we can look up the scholars, but I think to what Riley said earlier about throwing out the baby with the bathwater, like, there are going to be some scholars that have bad takes on things. But I mean, like, this is a very active field of academia. Like we can hop on Google Scholar right now, and there are people that are furiously writing papers, responding to other people that are furiously writing papers that are asserting their own theses and ideas. It feels to me like a very authoritarian move to be like, no, we are federally banning all critical race theory. Like, wouldn't it make more sense
I didn't say federally.
Oh, okay. Well, so if we don't agree with banning it, then we should probably just let school boards like decide if there are parts of it that they want to implement in the curriculum or the parts that they don't want to, because I think that there are things of value here that we can all agree that like, yeah, it might be good to teach this from this perspective or that from this perspective. Because I think normally when people call for banning it, they're talking about like this federal or every state banning critical race theory.
It's education is handled on the local level. Like there's been almost no talk. Joe Biden's president right now about banning on the federal level. And even if the federal government were to ban it in public education, what they would be doing is not subsidizing it, which only accounts for like 10% of education spending in the country. So like the federal government could not ban this. Local school boards and states have control over their curriculum. And I'm glad you mentioned authoritarianism, because Delgado is one of the founders of critical race theory, and he's very much against freedom of speech. He thinks it's damaging, and the idea that if you let all these ideas out into the world, that it will eventually lead to good results or better results or a widespread debate is completely false. And he believes in punishments for hate speech, which is authoritarian.
So Sean,
and again, you could call him like a random guy. I mean, he's one of the two guys that founded the discipline, but it might be like one random scholar.
So Sean,
Gotcha.
I mean, like,
just one last thing, and then you can take off. My understanding was that like we were trying to federally ban that at one point. That's why I thought Trump started that 1776 commission in response to the
Trump was not going to pay for it to be taught to the military and other government and other government employees. That had nothing to do with the education system. That had to do with training based on critical race theory being done.
So one of the goals was literally to increase patriotic education via like a nationalist
thing. The 1776 project in response to the 1619 project is a different thing from.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like that 1776 commission was literally trying to make like a centralized nationalistic curriculum that was kind of in response to like Trump's attacks on critical race theory.
Well, in response to the 1619 project, but sure.
Sure. Okay.
Just to pick up, so Sean, then maybe this is all right. I'm gonna like try to bridge the gap here, because I mean, like, if you're not arguing that we should ban it federally, then let me ask, so would you be fine like leaving it to essentially local school boards to be able to vote on just whatever parts of critical race theory they find to be most beneficial to students to be able to teach, and allow them to be able to implement it on a local basis? Like, if we're saying that there's some parts of it that are harmful, then leave it to local school boards to determine, all right, so what are the harmful parts? What are the parts that are actually beneficial? And be able to like sift it out on their own.
I mean, I wouldn't want this implemented anywhere, but like a federal ban is like something that's not existent. We have a federalist government. Like the federal government can't just ban something in the schools. But if you had parents with like school choice and they could opt their kids out of it, like, you could have it as an elective. Like California has had a bunch of these like programs as electives in their state. I still think they're damaging, but at least like you opt into that. Like I don't want this mandated. Like
then maybe the other question. All right, so I mean, like, if it's not, because I mean, like, a lot of the questions or a lot of the issues that you're bringing up, I mean, like, I would trust that school boards could be able to sift through and determine, like, all right, so like the parts where like the authoritarian aspect that you brought up before, right? I would assume that school boards could be able to reasonably parse out, like, okay, that's something that we shouldn't be allowed to, that we should not teach our kids, right? But like, do you think that there's any aspect of critical race theory that could be reasonably salvaged if school boards are left to their own devices that could be taught to kids in a safe way?
I mean, the whole program is anti-intellectual, so I wouldn't teach it. Like, if you're going to say, hey, here's one thing that one critical race theory scholar wrote that might sound reasonable, like, that doesn't mean that the discipline should still be taught, or like that specific portion of the discipline. I'm in favor of civil rights education in our public schools. I'm in favor of teaching negative history about the United States of America in our public schools. But critical race theory is not, I have no interest in it. I read over the scholars and like what their thoughts are in American society and how they come to justify their statements and policies, prescriptions. And no, it's like inherently a political ideology. And this isn't denied by any of the scholars. Like, it's inherently.
If she doesn't have a response to this, then she's done.
Go ahead. You keep using the word like anti-intellectual. I don't know what you mean by that.
They don't subject themselves to scrutiny from other academic disciplines.
Like, what do you mean when you say that?
So if you're a discipline in a university, right? There's like
Okay.
review boards and all this stuff to kind of like, it's like the peer reviewed system, right? Like they reject those things and are very insular. So they don't, because they say that the objective standards of the modern educational institution, I believe this comes directly from David Bell.
So critical race theorists don't.
Biased.
There's no peer review. They don't publish in journals.
I didn't say that there's no peer review, but I said that they reject criticism from outside. They even label criticism from non-whites on the outside as people like basically catering to the white academic structure. I mean, you could look up critical race theories views or theorist views on academia. Like
Doesn't peer review typically, like for the majority of peer review, doesn't that typically come from within your own discipline? Like, don't psychologists get super ass mad when like neurobiologists or neuroscientists try to publish stuff related to like what they feel in psychology? Or don't economists fight with other disciplines because sometimes people that study sociology, like criminal justice, get ass mad because a lot of economists will take like models and try to like model crime and stuff. Like that doesn't seem to be unique to critical race theory. In terms of like,
they still subject themselves to it. They can.
Well, but they fight like pretty vicious. I mean, like, but so
that's
like
good. That's what I would prefer.
Yeah, but necessarily so do critical race theorists as well. They must be. I mean, other people are publishing journals. They're publishing in journals. Like every field is going to subject us all. You're saying this like it's very special or peculiar that like critical race theorists.
It's how it's designed. It is very peculiar. Like this was. I'm sure there's other disciplines that are like in the activist studies like realm like this is that have followed suit, but yeah, it is. And they often label criticism against them racist and attacks on their person because they're telling personal stories about how they felt.
Do you think that
a personal story of how you felt in any kind of objective academic sense?
Yeah, but so like everybody in academia will fight when outside disciplines try to critique their ideas. That's not unique to critical race theory or any field. Even physicists and other disciplines will fight over like mathematicians and physicists will sometimes fight over things. I think the idea that there's like a hostility towards external review of your particular discipline, I don't think that's unique at all to critical race theory. In terms of like they get mad because people are critiquing their stories. I mean, like, are you asserting that like the majority of critical race theory papers are just stories? Like that's all it is? Or?
My point is, how can you critique like stories? Like storytelling is a big component of it. It describes itself as a holistic discipline.
But so if I were to go and look up like the majority of like published critical race theory papers, are all of them or the majority of them going to be like, yesterday I went to the store and there was a doll and she upset me because it was more expensive than
overwhelming majority? Like, is that even a knowable question? Like I would hope not, but I wouldn't be surprised if the answer was yes. I mean, Patricia Wilson's book, like The Rooster's Egg, is a bunch of stories. Like stories about her going to adopt a black kid, and then her deciding that this also proves that black people are undervalued in our society, that the fee for older black kids in this adoption center was half of the fee for younger white kids, which it could be indicative of racism, but I'm sure like if anybody has ever looked into adoption ever, you know that adopting older kids or adoption becomes more difficult the older the kids are. So obviously it would be more, they would try everything to get you to take those kids. But yeah, like it's storytelling for the, not all, but.
You think that you might be being like a little uncharitable? I mean, like right now, like you cited one example and when you were asked about, well, is this happening in the majority of cases? You're like, well, I hope not. And I mean, like right now, I mean, like if it is happening widespread, then yeah, that is a problem that, you know, the large academic field is based primarily on storytelling. But like right now, I mean, like, sure, we can criticize one person and that there's room to be able to do that, but it doesn't seem justifiable to be able to take like, oh, well, one person did it, so like it's possible that a lot of people could be doing that. Like that doesn't seem to be substantiated.
Well, again, these are like common criticism of the discipline that it's based on storytelling, and like again, it's not something that's denied by critical race theorists. I don't know, like maybe you should read some like foundational literature on it. And for me, like for you to call or say I'm being a little bit disingenuous, like I can cite multiple different authors and like absurd things that they said, But like, I think there's nothing more disingenuous than saying, well, do you think the overwhelming majority of all papers written on this topic ever fall into this category? Like, how would I possibly know that? I mean, I haven't spent my entire life studying this.
Well, I mean, the reason that I'm asking that question is because when we're at, like, when you bring up like individual people as examples for your argument to substantiate it, I mean, that falls into the same kind of issue as like citing to personal stories where you're only relying on like one example to try to prove a larger phenomena, right? Like I was reading like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy earlier to read about critical theory, right? And like you get like a pretty robust definition of like what critical theory is that isn't just reliant on like, oh, well, this one person did something and that's, and this is descriptive of like the entire field, right? Like, sure, like citing one person can be good if we're able to demonstrate it's like a representative of a larger phenomenon, but like you need a separate kind of example. Otherwise, like it is like individual anecdotal evidence, right? Like it's the same issue that like you're bringing up to criticize or like to make the criticism that you're alleging. Does that make sense?
Sure, but like I'm not citing random people that wrote some things about critical race theory. Like when I say Delgado, I mean Delgado as in Delgado and Bell, the foundational writers from it. Like
Do you think
I don't know like when I say Patricia Williams, she's a well-known scholar in critical race theory. She's often referenced in the papers of others. Like
I think that's something that would be more relevant or interesting, I guess, is because is rather than like this is like the foundational like writings on a particular topic, it would be more interesting to see like problematic implementations, because at the end of the day, implementation is what we're talking about. Like if we would have applied, if you go back a few decades, we would have applied the same thought to psychology, when it was a burgeoning field under Freud, when it was like first taking off, like all of these same criticisms could have been levied at psychology. And it's like, well, should we do any further studying? Should we do any more paper publishing? Like, this is like a waste of time. Like this guy is literally telling stories with no scientific backing. And the foundational expert in the field, the first guy to take psychology seriously, Sigmund Freud, is like just not doing a good job. Like, I'm sure that there are problematic views that are asserted by some early foundational critical race theorists. And there are probably like a wide number of topics that we disagree on. But in terms of like the actual implementation, like what, boils down to the curriculum or what is being taught to like educators or whatever, I haven't seen, and this is why I said at the very beginning that maybe we should focus on some of these individual topics. Like, I don't see there being a huge problem of like analyzing like, well, what do we mean when we say like objective truth, or when we analyze some particular standards by which we hold ourselves, or like why do we treat certain dialects different than others? Like, I don't think these are necessarily bad like things to be learning about in a classroom setting.
I do want to give you the last word, Sean, just because it is true that there's one person of your position, you could say, tonight. And so before we do, we'll give you a pithy last word. We do want to then transition into the next topic, namely what is and what isn't transphobia, where is the line drawn. So we'll give you a chance to give that last response, Sean.
Yeah. So overall, like if you look at the foundational writers, and you can read like papers, more common and well-known people are people like Ibram X. Kendi, who believes that no policies are neutral. Every policy either falls into the category of racist or anti-racist, and we have to promote anti-racism in order to reach equity, which is policies that actively try to reverse discrimination by creating positive discrimination. Again, his words, not mine. Is that you find this in the scholarship. There's an over-reliance on I lost my train of thought totally right there, and I'm about to bail out of the sentence. But yeah, so what you find, and what I gathered from my two opponents on this issue, is what I believe to be a lack of understanding on the issues that we're talking about. So like if I go to the foundations of the discipline and I talk about like what the original writers wrote about it and what scholarship through the years has promoted, I think that this is more substantial than the individual examples of schools, because I'm certain had I brought up like implementation in Michigan or implementation in North Carolina of these programs and people's objections of it, or the Oregon implementation, then those would have been also classified as anecdotes. So like maybe I'm wrong, maybe I misunderstood the parameters of the debate, but like when we talk about incorporating critical race theory in the curriculum, I think it's important to examine the foundations of critical race theory. Like who came up with this, not just what one school board is doing here versus another school board over there. So that's really it.
Quickly, James, I actually had 3 questions from Chad. Can I throw them at them, or should we move on to the next topic?
if it's possible to wait toward the end, because I was
Okay,
thinking we do
I
that
can do that.
clump Q&A in the end, but do want to
Oh.
mention, folks, if you are new here,
Okay, screw that. So, let's talk about this quickly and then we will wrap it up, because I am not sitting through another 2 hours of this, whatever this is. So, we get rid of you and we make you bigger. There we are. Alright, let's look at this thing. So, this entire debate was them circling around the drain on whether or not we can even scrutinize what critical race theory is, or whether or not AJW's examples are representative. Now, there are a lot of examples of people you could roughly classify as being associated with critical race theory being extraordinarily, shall we say, sloppy, or overbearing, or just unpleasant. You know, not behaving in a reputable way with respect to something as serious as the education of minors. However, these are two separate things. The people who are going to be making proposals specifically to elementary schools, or, for example, developing things like government seminars, stuff like that, these are going to be very different people from the people who are, more often than not, they're going to be very different people from the people in the academy who are analyzing and researching things and teaching. And generally, in my experience, the distance and quality between the two is night and day. Now, that being said, I have been in classes where there has been an extraordinarily low quality of scholarship, and it has often aligned with classes that are specifically concerned with specifically issues of racial politics and whatnot. Because it seems like there does appear to be an avenue in certain contexts for, I suppose, activist-oriented classes to, for whatever reason, exist alongside more serious academic classes. Now, crucially, that is more dependent on the individual professor or the TA or whoever's running it than, or not the TA, than the sessional, or what do you call them? Sessional. Who's running it, than on the department itself, which will largely have fairly, at least in my experience, will largely have fairly high standards in terms of its scholarship. You will find examples of poor scholarship in every department. It is entirely untrue to say that people in CRT do not subject themselves to critical review. People in CRT also covetously guard their journals and their departments and their chairs and their offices, etc. And they are also heavily selective of who gets to come in, like in any other department, and they are subject to, of course, all of the same positives and negatives that result from that. I mean, at the end of the day, insofar as AJ was arguing, I guess AJW was arguing that some of these things are being recklessly implemented in schools. I mean, I've seen examples of that. I mean, fair enough. But he never actually connects this to CRT in a definitive sense. This was a good question that Riley offered. What was really frustrating me is that when he would give examples of, say, a foundational theorist who was saying something that seemed on the surface to be absurd, she had no point of reference for challenging his characterization of that person. I mentioned this in the notes. An example of this is Jean Baudrillard, who was lambasted for, I believe was the title of his book, for the claim that the Gulf War never took place. The point was that there wasn't an event that we call the Gulf War that didn't take place. The point is that its characterization as what we conceive it to be was not grounded in the same objective way as we know for a certain fact that, the Twin Towers came down in 9/11, right? Like there was a level of recognition of the event as it is popularly construed, played a critical role in the concrete, not in the concrete, in the way in which the event was received by the general public, as opposed to something more concrete, like, again, the destruction of a physical building. Did I say seminary? I meant to say seminar if I said seminary. Seminary is for learning how to preach. Seminar is a form of class in which the professor guides discussion between students, some of which are typically required to present research papers and presentations for the consideration of the class. There is a huge advantage to seminar-style classes in that it forces students to really hone their understanding of a topic before presenting, so they don't look fools in front of the class. And like in any topic, especially in university, because frankly, the number of things we could spend our time learning is so broad, anyone who spends any amount of time studying a specific topic will outstrip anybody who hasn't been spending an equivalent amount of time on that specific topic. If you focus on one minor area of, let's say, political science, let's say the history of the concept of sovereignty or something, and your professor hasn't focused on that specifically, you will get beyond their level of competence fairly quickly. So seminars are great because it causes people to exchange specific angles of approach to whatever is being studied or discussed, if that makes sense. But there's not a whole lot to say here, because, I mean, Destiny had almost nothing to say except for the obvious point. I think Destiny did relatively well, but he waited too long. It seems like, so Riley seemed to be relying almost entirely on the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is fine, but I would have expected to see, I don't know. Like, all of these people, I know Sargon was reading a critical race theory reader a little while ago. That would have been good. That would definitely be good for somebody in Destiny and Riley's position to be somewhat acquainted with if you're going into a debate with someone like this. She certainly should have had some key writings as an example to focus on. I think Destiny's points regarding some of AJW's assumptions about what objectivity in historical terms means, or in terms of or with respect to like his characterization of in a sense admitting, or I guess positively engaging with different dialects of English in the United States. I think his objections to those characterizations were fairly on point. I think ultimately the problem with this was that it was, what did they call this? A panel. Why is this a panel? There's a reason why debates have moderators and segments in which you cannot be interrupted, and it's not just to protect the speakers from being spoken over or intimidated or what have you during the debate. One of the reasons why you have segments is that it gives you a specific amount of time in which you are expected to have a structured argument prepared. And there was no expectation placed upon any of these people. Had there been specific segments where they had to speak alone, and they weren't just allowed to sort of piggyback on prompts given by their interlocutors, Destiny would have had cited arguments in this debate. Riley would have had structured, cited arguments in this debate. AJW did, because he's the only person here who took this seriously. And he still botched it, but he botched it in the sense that his characterization of CRT, its relationship to peer review, things like that, is hopelessly fraught and politically slanted. He won the debate hands down because he's the only person who bothered to prepare. This was embarrassing. And I see there was one super chat comment by William Kurt. Thank you very much for $5. It's obvious that Sean was the only person who prepared for this. Everyone else is just winging it and talking about side issues. I wouldn't say they're talking about side issues, but he brought up very easily challengeable points that they couldn't challenge. it's just, it was just baffling. Anyways, this wasn't fun. I did not have fun doing this. I am really tired of Destiny and the general lackadaisical way in which he handles issues of importance. Either he is extraordinarily dismissive of serious people who have bothered to try, or he himself is just sort of vacant and doesn't care. And this debate was, well, should have been important. All it accomplished was it made people who know better angry, and it made people who don't feel validated, and that's never a good thing. Kelly asks, President Sunday, would you organize a better debate about critical race theory? I would love to. So in case anybody is not aware, which is distinctly likely because this channel is very small, I am now hosting debates between small channels of a particular quality that I verify personally via an audio call in advance. It is not perfect, sometimes make mistakes. So far, though, I've been fairly happy with the results. The idea is I want to use my platform to bring together channels of roughly my size, maybe slightly larger, maybe slightly smaller, so that we can sort of pool our collective, admittedly tiny amounts of clout, and fight the algorithm by getting all of our smart YouTubers together in some kind of cross-pollination effort between our communities. Because frankly, it's ridiculous that we have to circle clowns like Destiny in order to get any attention. Novens Hinhauser asks, what is the criteria for what you consider when performing well? I would consider a good performance to be one in which the person retains their cool, doesn't freeze up, has a bare bones, or at least has a strong sense of what they're going to be arguing and why. Conduct is important. I have strict rules of conduct. The use of slurs, for example, will result in an automatic removal of the person from the stream. If that cuts the debate short, so be it. I am perfectly fine with that. I am very much a quality over quantity person. So that's how that works. So for example, in the first debate I ran, I had someone who identifies as culturally right-wing called Ubersoy debating against Victor Magarino, who, if you're not familiar with him, he's a small YouTube channel that does excellent analyses and lectures on Marxian economics, or Marxist economics if you prefer. That went very well. Now, I think it's fairly easy to tell from the debate that Ubersoy, and he admitted to this, did not actually read the primary sources on, for example, the labor theory of value, what they were debating. However, he comported himself fairly well, and he had arguments, and the arguments didn't require that he understand what the LTV was. Now, his arguments, nonetheless, to my mind at least, it's been a little while, so I'm allowing myself to be unobjective at this point. His arguments nonetheless failed because they were addressing something that doesn't match the description of the LTV. However, as a cultural element, I think his approach was fine. I'm not going to disallow people from taking part on the grounds that their approach is flawed. I am, however, going to be very particular about people who don't comport themselves well and have a history of, if they're content creators already, have a history of very low-level content. The goal, the hope, is that something interesting will come out of it that's more interesting than what we saw here. Because this is what I want to avoid. I have nothing against Dylan Burns personally, but the hippy-dippy thing is a dumpster fire, and I don't like it one bit. William Kurt for another $5. Thank you so much. Also, I offered earlier to argue in favor of ethical right-wing politics since you proposed the debate. Yeah, sure. So I have a few prompts open right now for people who want to take part on my debate show called the Sunday Showdown. One of which is there an ethical / viable right-wing political theory? If you want to take part in this debate, either for or against, DM me either on Twitter or in the Discord server, and we can talk. But we will talk first. I'm not just accepting people blindly. But yeah, if you're interested in that, William, just message me and we'll have a chat. Yeah, and our next one is going to be on the Saturday of the 19th, between Dilvani the Goddess and Fellow Traveler, on whether or not a market or a planned economy is preferable. I'm actually looking forward to this one. Dilvani has a very small channel, but she is actually quite brilliant. And I'm not familiar with Fellow Traveler, but he's been recommended to me by friends who I trust, and I've spoken to him, and he's pretty solid. So, yeah. At any rate, oh, and before I forget, tomorrow evening I will be playing Disco Elysium. Thank you to my server. Thank you to server Denizen or Citizen Moonsweater for purchasing that for me. As well, Victor Magarino, who I mentioned earlier, has adopted my Discord server as his own. So it has changed from the Council of Days to the Cathedral, and hopefully it will be a hub in the future for similarly high-quality YouTubers. So, anyways, if you want to chat with him as well, that's the place to go. All right. Damn. What a clown show. Thanks, everybody, for enduring this with me. See some of you tomorrow, hopefully, and take care. Bye-bye now.